After the foregoing examination of the practice of the ancient Church and its dogmatic significance, the reception of Latins nowadays without baptism does not at all convince me that the Latin mysteries are valid in themselves, independently of the reception of those baptized in Latinism into the Orthodox Church. But, moreover, you are not completely correct in your historical affirmations. In the first centuries after the separation of Rome from the Church, Latins were differently received in the Greek and in the Russian churches, by baptism and by chrismation. For a long time there were no general decisions on this question. There is much information about the baptism of Latins. Even in the bull which marked the beginning of the unfortunate separation, the papal legates accused the Greeks, quote, "Like the Arians, they rebaptized those baptized in the name of the Holy Trinity, and especially Latins. Like Donatus, they affirm that with the exception of the Greek Church, the Church of Christ and the true sacrifice and baptism have perished in the whole world." End quote. At the very beginning of the 12th century, a Serbian prince, the father of Stefan Nemanja, was forced to baptize his son with the baptism of the Latins, but later rebaptized him in the Orthodox fashion when he returned to Russia. The Bishop of Krakow, Matthew, in a letter of 1130 to Bernard, the abbot of Clairvaux, invites him to concern himself with the conversion of the Russians to Latinism and affirms that the Russians rebaptized Latins. It is well known how kindly Ludwig VII was received by Manuel I in Constantinople in 1147. However, the description of his journey to the east, Odo de Dioglio, mentions that the Greeks rebaptized Latins. In the same 12th century, Arniphon, Bishop of Novgorod, instructs Kidicus that Latins should be received through chrismation. According to his words, this is how they were received in Constantinople. Nevertheless, details of an exclusively ritual character interest Niphon. At the end of the 12th century, Theodore Balsamon forbids Latin prisoners to be admitted to the sacraments until they renounce Latin dogmas and customs, until they have been catechized according to the canons and can be considered equal with the Orthodox. Balsamon proves the necessity of treating Latins thus by the fact that the Romans separated from the Church, and that the Pope is not commemorated together with the patriarchs. According to the interpretation of Canon 14 of the Fourth Ecumenical Council, Balsamon testifies that the Orthodox required renunciation of heresy from Latins if they wished to marry Orthodox. It is quite possible that by katechethi in the first case, and by exomniste in the second, the baptism of Latins is not implied, but the Byzantine canonist considers Latins as not belonging to the Church. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 bears testimony that after the apostasy of Rome, the Greeks began to rebaptize those baptized by the Latins, and practiced this sometimes in the 13th century. At about the same time, the Bulgarian Archbishop Demetrius Komatinos testifies that there were diverse attitudes towards the Latins and their sacraments. In 1222, Pope Honorius III mentions in a letter to the judges in Livonia that the Bishop of Livonia had informed him, quote, and then there's a long Latin phrase. In 1232, Pope Gregory IX wrote to the Polish clergy not to permit the marriage of Roman Catholic women to Russians, who have them rebaptized according to their own right. In Russian sources, there is testimony of the baptism of Latins from the 14th century. Our chronicles for 1333 report that Grand Duke Ivan Danilovich married his son Semyon. Quote, "From Lithuania they brought a princess for him by the name of Augusta, and in holy baptism she was called Anastasia." End quote. In the 15th century, the Greek Church stopped baptizing Latins. The reception of Latins into the Church was accomplished by chrismation. Such a practice was determined upon also at the Council of Constantinople in 1484, where the order for the reception of Latins required a renunciation of the filioque, unleavened bread, and other Latin customs, after which it read, quote, "And the man is immediately anointed by the priest with the chrism of the Church." End quote. Although they did not baptize Latins, they nevertheless received them as the ancient Church received Arians, Macedonians, and others. It is remarkable that the Greek writers of the 15th century prove by the chrismation of Latins upon their being received that these latter are heretics. Quote, "The ordinances of piety say," writes St. Mark of Ephesus, that even those who in the least fall away from the Orthodox faith are called heretics, and are also subject to the statutes against heretics? And why do we anoint with chrism those of them who unite themselves to us? Obviously, it is because they are heretics." End quote. Here, St. Mark of Ephesus bears witness that Latins were only chrismated, but this does not at all mean that he considers them as belonging to the Church. He speaks clearly and definitely on this question. "We," he says, "have cut them off and cast them out from the common body of the Church. We have abandoned them as heretics, and thus separated ourselves from them." End quote. St. Mark of Ephesus refers to the 7th canon of the Second Ecumenical Council in proof of the fact that Latins are received into the Church as were the ancient heretics, and that therefore they are likewise heretics. On the contrary, from the 15th century the practice of rebaptizing Latins began to be the rule in the Russian Church. Thus the chronicles remark that in the 15th century John Friazzini, a Venetian working in Moscow as a coiner, quote, "was baptized among us." We have an especially large number of testimonies of the rebaptism of Latins from the 16th century. John Lasky, Archbishop of Gniezno, reported about the Russians at the Lateran Council of 1514, quote, "They say that all subordinate to the Church of Rome are not true Christians and are not saved. They profane, blaspheme, mock, and despise all the sacraments of the Church." End quote. In the 1670s, Daniel, a prince from Bukhor, came to Moscow as the ambassador extraordinary of the Austrian emperor. We have his work, The Origin and Rise of Moscow, in which we read, quote, "Those of our compatriots who are converted to their faith they rebaptize as not properly baptized. They cite the following as the reason for this. Baptism is immersion and not sprinkling. Since the Grand Duke gives money to such people, often the frivolous let baptism be repeated upon them for the small profit, and thus put our religion to no little shame." End quote. At the end of his life, Tsar Ivan IV began to court Mary Hastings, niece of the English Queen Elizabeth. It is well known that this Tsar had a despotic attitude towards the Orthodox Church. However, when Bose, the ambassador of Elizabeth, replied to the demand that the bride accept Orthodoxy by saying that the Christian faith is one, the Tsar remarked decisively that, quote, "That princess who shall marry me must first be baptized into our Christian faith." End quote. In the August of 1590, Queen Elizabeth wrote to Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich reproving him because certain merchants, quote, "were forced to be baptized anew when they had already been received into Christianity through baptism." End quote. Nicholas Varkoch, ambassador of the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who was in Russia in the year 1593, testifies in the description of his journey, quote, "If baptized Christians happen to convert to their faith, they must allow them," that is the Russians, "to baptize them again, since the Muscovites doubt that our baptism is genuine. That poor sinner who allows himself to be baptized must renounce the baptism he has received and be baptized anew." End quote. And here is what we read in the encyclical letter of June 14, 1613, of Sylvester, Archbishop of Vologda, to the Archangelsk priest Bartholomew, quote, "When this letter reaches you, you, together with your fellows, the priests and deacons of Archangelsk, shall order those foreigners to prepare themselves for baptism, and you shall baptize them into our true Orthodox Christian faith according to the canons of the Holy Apostles and the Holy Fathers. You shall command them everywhere to curse and renounce their faith, to deny heathenism, and to turn to the true God. After baptism and communion, you shall also order them to fast as much as possible." End quote. In the beginning of the 17th century, at the end of the, quote, "time of troubles," the question of the rebaptism of Latins became a question of political importance in Moscow, because in 1613 Russia obtained a Russian dynasty instead of a Polish one, and also because the Russian people and the Russian hierarchy were quite convinced of the necessity of rebaptizing Latins. When they offered the throne of the Moscow Tsardom to the Polish Prince Vladislav, they required that he be baptized beforehand in the Orthodox faith. On August 17, 1610, St. Ermogen, Patriarch of Moscow, the metropolitans, archbishops, bishops, archimandrites, abbots and all the council of the church, the boyars, the courtiers, the military and the civil officials of all ranks wrote a, quote, instruction to the embassy, which had Metropolitan Filaret of Rostov at its head, and which was sent to the Polish king Sigismund III, with the request to release Prince Vladislav for the Moscow Tsardom. In this instruction, the following condition is repeated many times in the foremost position, quote, "And would His Majesty Prince Vladislav Sigismundovich be pleased to be baptized in the Orthodox Christian faith according to the Greek canon," end quote. And another, quote, "And will the Polish nobleman be pleased to say that the prince was so baptized in the Orthodox Christian faith, and that upon this second baptism there shall be no other baptism for a Christian," end quote. And to the boyar Prince Vasily Vasilievich and his companions say, quote, "We know that His Majesty the Prince is baptized in the Roman faith according to the Roman canon. But if His Majesty the Prince will take compassion on us and pity us, and will to join our Orthodox Christian faith of the Greek canon, it will be proper for His Majesty to be baptized with the true holy baptism of our holy Christian faith according to the Greek canon," end quote. They also sent a letter to Vladislav himself in the name of the Patriarch St. Ermogen, and from all the Russian clergy and laity of every rank and calling. In this letter the fundamental thought is, quote, "with all peacefulness and meekness and humility, accept holy baptism," end quote. And they point out St. Vladimir, equal to the apostles, as an example to Vladislav. In view of all these testimonies, I think that it would be an inaccuracy to call the decision of the Council of Moscow of 1620 an innovation. Indeed, the Council of 1620 itself looked on its decision not as a novelty, but as a confirmation of an old custom. Patriarch Filaret himself speaks of the incentives to the decision of 1620. Quote, "In my second year as chief shepherd, in the year 7128 from the creation of the world," that is, 1620, "two priests, Ivan and Ephemi, from the Church of the Honorable and Glorious Nativity of our Most Holy Lady, the Mother of God and Ever Virgin Mary, which is in Stolechniki, informed me concerning Jonah, Metropolitan of Sarsk and Podonsk, that this same Metropolitan Jonah commanded these two priests, Ivan and Ephemi, not to baptize the Poles converting from the Latin faith, Jan Slabotsky and Matvey Svetitsky, but only to anoint them with holy chrism and afterwards to give them communion in the most pure body and blood of the Lord. They brought me a written sheet taken from the ukaz of the Metropolitan, which ordained them not to baptize, but only to anoint them with holy chrism. I, the humble Filaret, did not overlook this schism, fearing lest the sheep of the flock of Christ might perish, and I deigned to correct the matter reported to me by the test of Scripture and true faith, so that in truth no pagan remnant nor Hebrew maliciousness should be mixed with the ripe wheat, but would be torn out like a tare, this leaving the field of the church clean. For this reason I ordered Metropolitan Jonah to appear before me." End quote. The Patriarch reminded the Metropolitan of Patriarch Ignatius, who, quote, "pleasing the Latin heretics, brought Marinka of the heretical papist faith into the Cathedral of the Dormition, and did not baptize her with the holy, perfect baptism of the Christians, but only anointed her with holy chrism, and then married her to that defrocked person, and like Judas the betrayer he likewise insulted Christ. For such a fault the hierarchs of the great holy Church of Russia deposed Ignatius from his throne and episcopal rank in the year 7114, that is, 1606, since he had disdained the canons of the holy apostles and the holy fathers." End quote. Patriarch Filaret further recalls how St. Ermogen sent him to Vladislav, quote, "to make him czar and to baptize him into our true Orthodox Christian faith of the Greek canon. And our father, the great, most holy Patriarch Ermogen, gave me a script from the canons of the holy apostles and the holy fathers for the strengthening of us all, and as an answer against the heretics of many different heretical faiths, why they should be baptized." End quote. The Patriarch speaks of how he studied the canons and understood, quote, "that all heretics of every different heretical faith are deprived of the true holy baptism, which is of water and the Holy Spirit. For this reason it is proper for all those who come to the Orthodox Christian faith from heretical faiths to be baptized perfectly with holy baptism." End quote. And another quote, But how do you, in this imperial city of Moscow, undertake to introduce and establish that which is in opposition to the canons of the Holy Fathers, the 7 ecumenical councils, the local councils, and the holy patriarchs? Why do you not order those coming to you from the Latin faith to be baptized in 3 immersions? And why do you not investigate the deviation of their heresy, but instead command only that they be anointed with holy chrism? Continuing, quote, I, the humble, do not even wish to hear of your newly introduced heretical delusion, since it is not in accordance with the divine canons that you introduce and teach new heresies, saying that it is not proper that those papists be baptized, and affirming that you do this in accordance with the canons of the Holy Fathers. For from the years of the Grand Duke St. Vladimir of eternal memory, who enlightened all great Russia with holy baptism received from the Greeks, and even until today in the year 7128, no one among us has dared commit such a scandalous act of heresy except Ignatius, the dethroned patriarch, and yourself. And finally he concludes, quote, Since the beginning of the state of Moscow until now, there has never been a case where Latin heretics and heretics of other faiths were not baptized, except for the case of Ignatius the Patriarch, who was deposed from his episcopal throne. End quote. In 1621, Patriarch Filaret issued a decree on how the White Russians should be examined, which of them to baptize, which to chrismate, and which neither to baptize nor chrismate. It was indicated that those baptized by the Uniates should be baptized with 3 immersions, quote, because they were baptized by an apostate who prays to God for the Pope. End quote. But upon writing this directive, the Patriarch also confesses that, quote, we have not introduced a new tradition, but only renewed and strengthened the ancient one. End quote. All these affirmations of Patriarch Filaret have a genuine historical foundation. This is the reason why even the foreigners who were in Moscow after 1620, when recalling the rebaptism of Latins, do not speak as though this practice had just recently appeared. In the 1630s, Adam O'Leary became quite interested in the question of baptism in Old Russia. He describes rites, reports the biographies of the more famous of baptized persons, discusses the fact of rebaptism from the historical point of view. Quote, the Russians undoubtedly borrowed the practice of rebaptizing Christians who go over to them from other confessions from the Greeks, who, after their separation from the Latin Church, consider Latin baptism insufficient, and therefore they baptize a second time those who wish to come over to them from the Western Church and become members of the Greek Church. End quote. Further on, O'Leary cites the Acts of the Lateran Council. From O'Leary we could rightly expect remarks that the rebaptism of Western Christians in Moscow is only a recent innovation. Yet we find nothing of the kind. Baron Augustin Meyerberg, who was in Moscow in 1661, reports without any stipulations that, quote, the Muscovites believe that baptism has no power unless the baptized person is completely immersed 3 times, according to the custom of the ancient church. For this reason, when someone baptized according to the Latin faith goes over to the Muscovite faith, they rebaptize him by triple immersion, as one not baptized according to the ritual of the church. They even dissolve a marriage contracted by him beforehand, considering that he was unlawfully led to the other sacraments, having not entered the church by the sacred door of baptism. They at once anoint the baptized with chrism, not placing any value on Latin chrismation, considering it ineffectual. End quote. The Old Russian practice, confirmed by the Council of 1620, was changed at the Council of Moscow in 1667. This is understandable. The Council of 1667 is distinguished for the fact that, led by Greeks often of dubious worth, it condemned everything, even in the minor rites of the Russian Church, that deviated from Greek practice. Until now, the curse hastily placed by the Council on the Old Russian rite, as on a heresy, still causes turmoil in the Russian Church. Obsequious in relation to the secular government, the Greeks were at that time ready even to proclaim the principle that the state is superior to the Church, and only the protest of the Russian hierarchy prevented such a solution of the problem of the mutual relations of Church and State. Concerning the rebaptism of Latins, the Council of 1667 decided, it is not proper to rebaptize Latins, but, after they forswear their heresies and confess their sins and submit a written statement, let them be anointed with the holy and great chrism, and let them be administered the holy and most pure mysteries, and thus be united to the holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. But the council could bring only the decision of the Council of Constantinople of 1484 and the words of St. Mark of Ephesus in support of its decree. It is worthy of note that the decision of the Council of 1667 did not immediately change the Russian rule of practice for receiving Western Christians. At the end of the 17th and at the beginning of the 18th century, they were still rebaptized. Here is what John Korb, who was in Moscow in 1698, writes in his diary, quote, "The Russians do not recognize as truly baptized and as Christians those who, according to the Roman rite, are reborn in Christ by mere sprinkling in the name of the Most Holy Trinity. The Muscovites, according to their stubborn superstition, affirm that baptism must be accomplished through immersion, since the old man must be drowned in the water, and this can be done only by immersing him in the water, and not by sprinkling him with it. Holding steadfastly to this error, the Russians admit Christians, regardless of their confession, to renewal of baptism, when they voluntarily accept the Russian schism." End quote. Henrik Sederberg was in Russia from 1704 to 1718, and in his Notes on the Religion and Morals of the Russian People, he writes, quote, "Although it is true that they consider Roman Catholics Christians, they nevertheless consider their teaching filled with countless errors, and therefore, placing them on a par with others who come to their faith, they baptize them once again, saying that they were Latins." End quote. On this point, according to Sederberg's remark, the Russians differ from the Greeks. But meanwhile, at the very same time, the Church of Constantinople extended the decision of the Council of 1484 to apply to Lutherans and Calvinists. As a friend of all German Lutherans, Tsar Peter I asked the Patriarch of Constantinople how Lutherans should be received into Orthodoxy. In 1718, Patriarch Jeremiah answered with a written statement which was thereupon included in the Complete Collection of the Laws of the Russian Empire, Volume 5, number 3325. In it, the Patriarch, ready to please the Russian Tsar, decrees that, quote, "Let those who turn away from the Lutheran and Calvinist heresy be no longer rebaptized, but let them be made perfect Christians, sons of light and heirs to the kingdom of heaven by merely being anointed with holy chrism." End quote. Afterwards, and without any conciliar decision, for the conciliar order of the Russian Church was abolished by Peter I, Latins began to be received even without chrismation. From the 17th century, Russian theology begins to fall under Latin influence. Kievan practice in the 17th century was different from the Muscovite. In the Trebnik, that is the Book of Needs, of Peter Mogila, an idea unknown to the ancient Church intrudes, that there is some sort of validity to mysteries performed outside the Church. In this Trebnik, it is said of Lutherans and Calvinists that, quote, "It is not at all proper to rebaptize them since they are baptized," end quote, and of Latins, quote, "But as for these, not only do we not baptize them, but if they have been chrismated by their own, we do not anoint them with holy chrism." End quote. In the Trebnik of Peter Mogila, a dogmatic foundation is placed under a practice, which in the ancient Church was admitted only according to the considerations of Church economy. Baptism, chrismation, and priesthood are not repeated because supposedly, quote, "they leave a stamp, that is, an indelible seal or a sign upon the soul of the recipient," end quote. And again, quote, "For baptism signs or seals the soul of the person baptized, such that he is known to be a sheep of the flock of Christ, and is written in the book of life. Chrismation signs or seals the chrismated person, such that he is distinguished from the unchrismated, being inscribed in the ranks of the warriors of Christ." End quote. But how can one be a sheep outside the one flock of Christ? How can one be a soldier of Christ while waging war against the Church of Christ? It is in Latin theology with its opus operatum that the source of this theory of the validity of mysteries performed outside the one Church of Christ lies, a theory which has been adopted by certain of the new Russian theologians. Patriarch Jeremiah wrote quite decisively in the document mentioned above, quote, "We confirm and establish that this be unchanging for all ages, firmly and forever preserved by posterity." End quote. Not 40 years had passed when the very Church of Constantinople began to baptize heretics upon their conversion to the Church. Under Patriarch Cyril V in 1756, it was determined to receive those coming from the Western confessions as, quote, unsanctified and unbaptized, end quote. Then a reference is made to the unity of the true and apostolic church, which possesses the mysteries. Quote, the baptism of the heretics, however, as divergent from and alien to the divine apostolic ordinance, is unprofitable water, after the word of the sacred Ambrose and the great Athanasius, and it gives no sanctification to the recipient, and is unprofitable for the cleansing of sins, and therefore it is rejected. End quote. At the end of the 18th century, the Greek rudder, Pedalion, was compiled, in which Latin baptism is named baptism falsely so called, and the first canon of St. Basil the Great in its dogmatic part is applied to the Latin hierarchy, quote, they are become laymen, end quote. It is true that the decision of 1756 was passed under extremely restless conditions of church life. At that time, throngs of people rose up against Patriarch Paisius, and once again elevated to the patriarchal throne Cyril V, who, even earlier during his first patriarchal reign, that is from 1748 to 1751, was an advocate of rebaptizing Latins. One must not explain the events of the year 1756 only by the activity and preaching of the monk Auxentius, for he was strangled and drowned in the sea by the Turks even before the elevation of Cyril V to the Patriarchate. Professor A. P. Lebedev may not sympathize with the decision of 1756 and may quote the indignant words of Vendotis directed against Patriarch Cyril V. He may scoff at the Greek rudder. But this circumstance does not change the fact that from the middle of the 18th century on, the Greeks began to rebaptize Latins. However, there were sometimes deviations from this practice in the East, for example, upon the reception of Arab Roman Catholics in Ptolemaides, or of Syrian Melkites in the year 1861. Such is the history sketched in brief of the order of reception into the Orthodox Church of Western Christians after the falling away of the Patriarchate of Rome from the Church. For whole centuries the practice of the Eastern Church was diverse, wavering between baptism and chrismation. Thereafter, in local churches, different conciliar decisions were made which also altered in various centuries. In 1484, the Greek Church decreed that Latins should be chrismated, but at this same period, the Russian Church more and more sanctioned the practice of rebaptism, confirming it later at the Council of 1620. In 1667, under the influence of the Greeks, the Russian Church decreed that Latins should be chrismated, and at the beginning of the 18th century it decreed that even Lutherans should be received by chrismation. This practice was still more mitigated in the Russian Church. Those chrismated in the Latin Church were not rechrismated. In 1756, at the very same time, the Greek Church established the practice of rebaptizing Latins and Lutherans, however making some condescension if the Latins were an Arab or a Syrian. How is one to regard all these historical facts? How must he think of them, and what attitude must I have towards them as a member and priest of the Eastern Church? Can I admit that this practice is inseparably linked with the dogmatic understanding of the unity of the Church? Does the reception of Latins without baptism mean that they are members of the same church to which I belong? But then, how will I regard my church, which now recognizes Latins as her members, possessing her gifts of grace, and then begins to baptize them like pagans and Jews? If all Latins are to be baptized, why can Arab Roman Catholics not be baptized? What did St. Ermogen, Patriarch of Moscow, who received a martyr's death from the Latins, do when he demanded the baptism of Prince Vladislav? Did he not, in spite of the 10th article of the Symbol of Faith, require a second baptism? If the rebaptism of Latins was a second baptism, then do not hundreds of Orthodox hierarchs deserve to be deposed according to the 47th Apostolic Canon, which reads, quote, if a bishop or presbyter shall baptize again one rightly having baptism, or shall not baptize one polluted by the ungodly, let him be deposed, as one mocking the cross and death of the Lord, and not distinguishing priests from pseudo-priests. End quote. No, I cannot dare to think that the local churches, Greek and Russian, have throughout the course of centuries mocked and are mocking the cross and death of the Lord. If sacraments outside the Church are valid and grace-bestowing, one can only accept them. Then to change the practice of receiving converts, as did the Greeks and the Russians from the 11th century to the 18th, means to blaspheme and to be subject to anathema. I cannot recognize my own church as having blasphemed or blaspheming. For this reason, one must seek explanation for church practice in relation to the Latins only in the considerations of church economy, and not in the dogmatical understanding of the unity of the Church of Christ. The Eastern Church, just as the ancient Church, has not gone astray or erred. For although at times, for the sake of the profit of human souls, she has made a condescension by not requiring that a new rite of baptism be performed upon converting Latins, even though their rite differs from the Orthodox in its external aspect, that is, sprinkling, she has nevertheless retained immutably her dogmatical understanding of the unity of the Church. The decisions of the Church and authoritative Church writers demanded the chrismation of Latins. Receiving Latins without chrismation is only a local custom of the Russian Church, which was introduced under the influence of the Trebnik of Peter Mogila, and was even prompted by the theological spirit of Catholicism itself. Everything which is the sad result of the influence of Latin scholasticism in our theology cannot be, of course, more authoritative than the teaching of the ancient Church and the direct heir of her grace-filled gifts, the Eastern Church.